So I get to have the privilege and honor of introducing today's speaker. Keryn Gedan was a Tufts Environmental Studies and Biology double major, graduated in 2002, and then went on to do a year in Panama, and then later went to Brown University, where she completed her PhD in 2010. And since 2016, she's been an assistant professor at George Washington University in the Department of Biological Sciences. Keryn sort of is like, represents sort of all that is really cool about science. So she asks amazing questions, works on sort of systems that are kind of coastal in nature. And she also goes into each project not knowing what she's going to find. She doesn't have preconceived ideas. She lets the science speak to her. She lets the communities talk to her. She does science that people care about. So she works with stakeholders. She works with other scientists. And from the very time she was at Tufts, I can remember her sort of innate curiosity and her sort of desire to see what comes and to be able to talk about whatever may happen. So she's a coastal ecologist who's really interested in global climate change and how it affects sea level rise and its effects on all sorts of different communities. And today she's going to talk a little bit about ghost forests. And as I mentioned before, her work is super collaborative, and she has really built up the ability to work with really diverse people. And I think that's a real tribute to her as a scientist, is the way she welcomes others to sort of collaborate. Her research is supported by the National Science Foundation, Maryland Sea Grant, the USDA, the National Fish and Wildlife Federation. And welcome all of you. Keryn, thank you for coming to Tufts, back to Tufts.
Thanks so much, Colin. Thanks for that introduction. And of course, I really wish I could be there in person. I was thinking we could go to DeWick afterwards and have a dining hall meal, and I also would visit the greenhouse because I was the greenhouse waterer when I was a student there. But now I am at GW and working in the mid-Atlantic, and I'm actually from Maryland. So this is kind of back to my home turf. And I'm really excited to tell you today about some changes that are going on in the coastal landscape of the mid-Atlantic, and particularly the Chesapeake Bay and eastern shore of Maryland and Virginia. So this is what a ghost forest looks like generally, and I'm going to tell you a lot more about this kind of emerging environment today. So this work has to do with sea level rise causing changes in the coast. So I just wanted to get started with this curve, this global sea level rise curve, showing that sea levels are indeed rising. They're rising at a rate we haven't seen in all of history. And the global mean rate of sea level rise right now is 3.6 millimeters per year, measured by satellite altimetry. And it's accelerating. So if you fit a curve to this line, a quadratic fit is better than a linear fit. And that tells you that it's actually accelerating over time. And the acceleration is 0.084 millimeters per year. But if we look at local tide gauges within the mid-Atlantic region where I am, we see that the rates of sea level rise and accelerations are even higher than the global mean. So these are two tide gauge records from Maryland and Virginia from the mid-Atlantic. And you can again see that quadratic fit, that accelerating rate of sea level rise. And here in the table, you can see that our rates of sea level rise are, even over this long period of history, are much greater than the global mean. And in fact, it's some of the highest rates in the country. So if we look at the national record of NOAA tide gauges, so this is all the tide gauges around the country, a study that was done not long ago, not too long ago, but recent studies have bore this out. This is just a really nice graphic of what's going on. Demonstrate these higher rates of relative sea level rise in the mid-Atlantic. And so they call this the mid-Atlantic hotspot of sea level rise. And it stretches from Cape Cod to Cape Hatteras. So you can see these kind of warm colors here in the mid-Atlantic. So sea level rise is happening at a faster rate in the mid-Atlantic. So we're starting to see these changes in the coast that maybe are not visible in other places. So this is why it's a great place to study sea level rise related changes. And I've also labeled here the Virginia Coast Reserve, LTER, which stands for Long-Term Ecological Research. So this is an NSF funded program that has these long-term research sites around the country. And the Virginia Coast Reserve is the one that I'm going to talk about today. So that's where it's located, right in the middle of this hotspot. So because of sea level rise, we know we're seeing an increase in coastal flooding. And I think this has been in the popular press a lot. So you may be familiar that coastal areas are experiencing more days of flooding. I've got some data here from a pretty recent paper and just showing you the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic. Of course, the Mid-Atlantic is experiencing this much more than the Northeast. And that in part also has to do with the expansive coastal plain that's in the Mid-Atlantic, that's not in the Northeast. So you have a higher slope of the coastal uplands in the Northeast that tends to make these kind of events a little more rare. In the Mid-Atlantic, we're seeing this all the time in coastal areas. A lot of the places I work, the roads are regularly flooded, properties are being affected, property values are dropping, people can't sell their properties, some people are needing to raise their houses and things like that. So these are real issues definitely affecting coastal communities. And this is only expected to increase because of that accelerating rise. So you can see the predictions here. Each one of the dots in this graph is a tide gauge, again, location where we can predict the changes in flood events per year. You can see this, the top of this axis is 350. So this is nearly year-round flooding. So this is a very visible change due to sea level rise. And there's been a lot of discussion on how to adapt to it. But one thing that may be a little less apparent to the public, maybe less represented in the media, is the effect of sea level rise on tidal wetlands. And I've studied tidal wetlands for a long time, so I pay attention to this stuff. And I just want to explain to all of you how sea level rise is expected to affect tidal wetlands. So tidal wetlands occur in a very narrow elevation band across the coast. They basically exist from mean sea level to mean higher high water. So that's the regular daily reach of the tides. So it varies by tidal range, but in any case, it's always very restricted. And they're very influenced by the tides. If they're dominated by these terrestrial plants, and if the terrestrial plants are underwater or inundated for too much of the day, they can die. If the plants die, the habitat erodes away. At the same time, as sea level rises, it pushes farther inland, and the coastal upland species can't tolerate the salinity that's in the seawater. So these trees tend to die back, and that gives an opportunity for these marsh plants to migrate in. So we call this marsh migration. So this is kind of representing ghost forests. This is representing marsh migration. And this is representing the erosion and loss of marshes due to sea level rise. So give you a better feel for this on a map. This is a map of the Mid-Atlantic from NOAA's Digital Coast Sea Level Rise Viewer, where you can actually take a look at different elevation gradients and where sea level rise is predicted to inundate. And these are some field sites that I work on around the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic seashore. And again, the Virginia Coast Reserve is down here. And this is present day mean higher high water. And in purple are the tidal wetlands. There's expansive tidal wetlands on both coasts. Has a really high rate of relative sea level rise. In the Atlantic coast here is 5.3 millimeters per year. So this is like, 1.5 times the global rate. And we have observed marsh loss at the VCR. There was a historical study done not long ago that found 63 square kilometers lost, or 19% of the marshes have been lost in that time period from 1851 to 2010, when we have good map data. And that's due to both barrier island transgression. The barrier islands are migrating towards the mainland with sea level rise, as well as edge erosion of the marsh, like I presented in the last diagram. But we're also finding that marsh migration into uplands can offset marsh habitat losses due to sea level rise. So another study that was done in the Chesapeake Bay found that the migration into uplands actually directly offset all of the losses due to this edge erosion. And as a result, over the last 150 years, we've actually retained the same net amount of habitat as prior to sea level rise. But the predictions are dire. So this is what 2100 is predicted to look like in this area based on the sea level rise curves. So there's a lot of anxiety or concern that tidal marshes will be lost due to these accelerating rates of sea level rise. And I'm really interested in this process of marsh migration into uplands, because this is kind of the future of our marshes. So these areas where the forest trees die back, we call ghost forests, and it's kind of like a negative branding, but actually I see these as the future of tidal marshes, and a really positive phenomenon in some sense. So these ghost forests are really widespread. Geographically, they've been observed in Canada, in New Jersey, and even in palm tree forests in Florida. And I'll show you more at the end about what I'm doing to try to track where ghost forests are occurring. But this is just to give you a sense that these can occur in diverse geographies and in different species of trees. This is what a ghost forest looks like in the mid-Atlantic in Maryland. This is a place that I work in, Fishing Bay. It's a really beautiful, expansive marsh. And you can see, if you kind of look through the foreground into the background, you can see thousands of dead trees in this area. This is new because as sea levels have been rising, they've always killed a few trees at the uplands, but usually this happened at such a slow rate that the trees fell down before they really accumulated in any number. So the reason ghost forests are occurring is because the pace of sea level rise has changed, so that you get standing dead accumulating on the landscape, these standing dead snags. So I wanted to try to figure out the pace that these things are accumulating at. So we did a study, a land cover change study of a coastal county in Maryland. So you can see it highlighted here in red. This is a county, Somerset County, that's very low elevation, very shallow sloping, and it has these three large peninsulas that are predominantly tidal marsh mixed with some uplands that are in forest and farmland. So on a county scale, the land use is fairly evenly split between emergent wetland, forested land, and agricultural land. There's very little urban in this kind of rural area. And we used a very high resolution digital imagery to detect this change over a very short amount of time. So we used imagery called the National Agricultural Imagery Program, or NAPE data set, that's collected every other year by the USDA in aerial flights. The unique thing about this data set is it's 4 spectral bands and it's 1 meter resolution. So you can see very fine change on the landscape, which presents some challenges in actually detecting change, because at that scale, the landscape is very, very variable, but we are able to use some computer algorithms to kind of get around that and do a supervised classification of the landscape into land cover types. And you see these land cover types here on the x-axis that we sorted the pixels on this landscape into. And we looked from 2009, the earliest date of that imagery, to 2017, which at the time we did the study was the latest date of that imagery, to see how land cover changed during those 8 years. And highlighting the changes here in yellow, and over here you can see that the change pixels and the pixels that didn't transition in land cover in gray. And overall, all of the areas that transitioned in land cover were closer to the shoreline and lower in elevation than those that didn't. So this is a signal that sea level rise is driving these changes. This is called an alluvial plot. If you've never seen one, I'm going to take just a minute to explain it, but it's a really great way to display a lot of data about land cover transition in sort of one graph that becomes pretty easy to digest once you know what you're looking for. So on the y-axis here, we have square kilometers or area. And on the x-axis is time. So 2009, the earliest date, and 2017, the later date. Each of these strata represents a land cover type and this is showing all of the land that transitioned. So you see here where it originated in these strata, and then the flows lead you to what type of land cover it transitioned to. So we can see from these strata at 2009 that agriculture represented the largest class of land cover that transitioned. And the biggest bulk of that actually transitioned to emergent wetland. If we look at the forest transitioned to scrub, shrub, wetland, and emergent wetland. So you can see where the different land cover, kind of what it became. So overall, in this very short time period, we saw that 3.5 square kilometers of farmland, which was 1% of the county's farmland, and 1.4 square kilometers of forested land, which is 0.5% of the county's forested land, transitioned to wetland during the study period. Now, 1%, 0.5%, those sound fairly small, but this was only 8 years, and we expect the pace of change to only accelerate. So I found this to be impressive. And I think this has affected a lot of policymakers and farmers in the area to actually have these numbers, because they see, different things happening to farmland. There's solar farms being developed in this county. There's some development from a small town that's growing an area. Different things are happening, and now they see, okay, well, sea level rise also poses another threat to our farmland that we have to kind of address and understand what's happening. And this was a big surprise, because people have been observing these ghost forests appearing on the landscape. It's hard to miss when you see thousands of dead trees, but people hadn't really thought that agricultural land was being affected. And so we documented that it is, and possibly at even higher rates than forested land. So we did a study, an analysis controlling for elevation, found it was even more likely to transition than forested land. So now I'm doing some other research on these ag lands to try out some different crop trials that might be more salt tolerant, and also some restoration some restoration trials with some different perennial grasses, because people are really thinking about what to do with these lands, how to structure different policy programs and recommendations for landowners who have this issue on their land. So just yesterday, I was at a workshop with farmers from the region, just talking to them about their issues and what we might be able to do. And I'd be happy to answer any questions on that, but I am going to shift back to forests now so you can learn more about the forest for the rest of this talk. So the place I've been studying the forested land most is in the Virginia Coast Reserve. Let me just see if I can to get out of this pointer to be able to show you this drone video of the area. So this is the Brownsville Forest beneath us. And you can see as we move towards the marsh, there's more and more of these dead tree snags. This marsh vegetation in the high marsh is a mix of salt marsh hay or Spartina patens. And the black needle rush in this darker color is Juncus rosmarianus. And then down here, if you're familiar with marshes, this is the low marsh dominated by Spartina alterniflora or salt marsh cordgrass. And you can see a view out to this tidal creek, which leads out to the bay. So when you think about how these changes are occurring, this is kind of my conceptual diagram. Can think about this ecotone here between the marsh and the forest. And this ecotone is migrating across the landscape with sea level rise. So the forest is converting to ecotone community and the ecotone is converting to marsh. So this is kind of helpful to frame the issue. So we set up plots across this gradient from marsh to forest in 3 different zones based on the health of the trees, essentially. So in the high forest, we called these plots high forest because the trees were fairly healthy, and look around, the understory is fairly open the way it is in a maritime forest generally. In the mid forest here, we saw stress in the tree canopy, so browning branches, maybe a few dead trees. And in the low forest here, we had a lot of dead tree snags, and it was clear that this area was transitioning to marsh. So this is the gradient, and we call this a space for time approach or a chronosequence because we know that at some point the low forest looked like the high forest. And so this is changing over time, and this ecotone is migrating inland. And that's the process of change that I wanted to study. So how much time has elapsed since the low forest looked like the high forest? So I tried to estimate this in 2 different ways. Neither of them is perfect, and we're still working on some collaborators doing some dendrochronology to try to get at also when different trees died and when tree recruitment events happened to get at this question also. But for right now, we can look at this based on the vertical distance and the lateral distance. So using the vertical distance, the low forest plots are an average of 0.087 meters from the high forest in elevation difference. So it's a very, very shallow slope, a very small distance. And based on sea level rise being this historical rate of 3.76 millimeters per year at the closest tide gauge to this site, then the time it takes for that distance to change is just 23 years. So that's a very rapid pace of change. So using the lateral distance, we looked at the empirical rate of change in the ecotone at this site. Basically, how fast has the canopy been retreating that marsh forest edge over time? And we found that the lateral rate of retreat is 0.57 meters per year. And since this distance is 177 meters, it would take 311 years at that pace to change the high forest to look like the low forest. So something between 23 years and 311 years is how much time. That's a really big range, but it's probably more on the lower end than the higher end based on the data I'm going to present to you. We've been monitoring a lot of different things in this forest. It's part of this long-term ecological research site, and so we're planning to do these for a long time. We structured our data collection into 3 levels of the forest: the canopy layer, the subcanopy layer, and the herbaceous layer. So at the canopy level, we're taking canopy cover photos and leaf area index. We are doing a tree census, and we've tagged every live and dead tree. We take DBH of all those trees annually. And then at the subcanopy layer, we do a shrub census, and we're mapping the shrubs and the Phragmites. At the herbaceous layer, we're doing seedling counts, and we have some marked quadrats and litter fall collection. And we're also measuring a lot of the soil and groundwater abiotic conditions. So jumping into the data here, we have the composition of the live trees, and I think this data is really exciting. On the x-axis here are the different plots in the low forest, mid forest, and high forest, and the number of trees of different species. So what you can see right off the bat is that there's a more diverse group of live trees in the high forest, and you lose that diversity towards the low forest. Also, there's fewer live trees in the low forest, and it's predominantly made up of only 2 evergreen species: Pinus tata, which is the dominant species in the canopy, and it's the loblolly pine. And then the red cedar, Juniperus virginiana, that becomes really predominant in the low forest, but is not really a major feature of the forest, the higher levels. If we look at the dead trees, we also see big differences. First of all, there's many more dead trees in the low forest, which was how we kind of designed this plot setup. But we also see, you know, the loss of those hardwood species, even in the deadwood component. So we've mapped the Phragmites as an invasive species that is really important in this region, and its common name is the invasive common reed. So it's actually an invasive lineage from Europe that has become a predominant feature of marshes all around the US, even around the world, actually. But you probably know that species if you've driven south to New York or all the way down to DC, and there's tons of Phragmites on any marshes that the highway crosses. It's a really dominant feature of developed and disturbed tidal wetland sites. And we're really interested in this species for reasons I'll tell you in a moment, but we surveyed Phragmites across the site with an index, a density index from absent in blue here to a fully developed stand in red. So red, warmer colors mean more Phragmites. And what you can see looking across these plots is more Phragmites in the low forest and less, but still present in the mid and high. So what we infer from this is that Phragmites actually recruits into the high forest, but only becomes dominant as the forest dies back. Whereas the shrubs in the subcanopy showed a really different pattern. So if you look at this map, these are wax myrtle shrubs are really abundant in this mid forest zone and less abundant in the high forest and low forest. So we find that the shrubs are kind of an ephemeral state of this, this migrating ecotone, that they become really abundant as the forest dies back and then are quickly outcompeted or suppressed by other vegetation. We suspect Phragmites. So this is just showing you Phragmites on the landscape. This is a study that was done in Delaware Bay, looking at historical imagery and how the ecotone has migrated across the landscape. So they found overall 141 meters of migration in the lateral direction since 1930, but over 50% of this area became Phragmites rather than being native species of salt marsh. And so there's sort of a confounding variable of time that Phragmites, you know, just got established in the US in 1900 and has spread up and down the coast. So the invasion is continuing to grow in its range at the same time as the forest is dying back. But we find that Phragmites is really able to take advantage of this forest retreat and ghost forest formation to become a dominant part of the landscape. This is really a concern to managers because it's not very good wildlife habitat. There's a lot of species that depend on the high marsh native grasses to survive. And so we're really interested in seeing areas dominated by native grasses as opposed to Phragmites. So one manager said to me, I just want to make sure the whole thing doesn't convert to Phragmites as the trees die back. So we've been researching this species in different ways. This is a study where we mapped Phragmites across ecotones at several sites in the Chesapeake Bay. And we found that it's often present in these forested areas. So the Virginia Coast Reserve data that I showed you is not our first observation of Phragmites in the subcanopy. And we transplanted 4 very common species into the forest edge and the marsh edge to compare how they survive. And we found that actually Phragmites survives better in the forest even than it does in the marsh at this seedling stage. It grew faster, and it like the forest is lower salinity than the marsh. It's also lower light availability, but we found that Phragmites could tolerate the low light availability, and we suspect it can just hang on until light availability increases, at which point it kind of prospers. So I wanted to show you also some of the abiotic data from these plots in the Virginia Coast Reserve. So first of all, salinity varies across this gradient, as you might expect. In the low zone, we have salinities about 4 parts per thousand. And just for reference, ocean water is about 32 to 35 parts per thousand salinity. So much lower than, say, in a tidal marsh, but still these are levels that can kill terrestrial plants that are not halophytes. So we do see, regularly salinity levels that kill these plants, and less so in the mid and the high. These are lower levels, but still higher than, an upland field. But we also had a tropical storm hit. It's kind of interesting because it was an offshore tropical storm. Like, we didn't get a drop of rain, but the pressure system and the winds kept the tides really high at our site. So we had tides like a meter above a normal high tide. And it happened to be the spring tide series. So we were already getting pretty high tides. So you can see in this green line, the tides that we got that were much above the predicted tide level. And this is what our site looked like. It was inundated at all levels. And we saw the salinities rise just after that event to much higher. I mean, these are really remarkable salinities for a coastal forest. So we're really interested to see the repercussions of this event, and also how often we get events like this. We were able to track the salinity in some groundwater wells that we had, and we saw that the overwash kind of infiltrates the soil, and the salinity actually sticks around for several months before it drops back down to these pre-event levels. The elevation, on the other hand, across this site, I already presented to you that 0.087 meters. It's really a subtle elevation gradient. So there's only about 20 centimeters, if that difference in the across the gradient, 10 to 20 centimeters. And it's really mild. So this is why it's really interesting to see that the ecological patterns, ecological differences we're seeing are really driven by salinity and not so much by elevation, which is tied to inundation. So this was our second year of monitoring. So we're starting to see the changes emerge over time. And in just this first year of monitoring, we've seen 13 trees die. So it's not a lot. It's about 2% of the trees in the census. But we are already seeing some interesting patterns. So we found in the low forest, the only trees that died were the loblolly pine, whereas in the mid forest, you had a higher diversity of tree mortality. And in the high forest, it was just one species, this Nyssa, one of the hardwoods that died. So I'm interested to see in future years, what kind of patterns emerge in tree mortality. And also the mapping of Phragmites and wax myrtle shrubs. So here we see in Phragmites, we're seeing a lot of increases in the low and mid zone. Whereas the wax myrtle shrubs, we see the increases happening in the high forest. And we actually see in the low forest a lot more decreases. So just kind of reiterating the trends that we saw in the mapping to begin with in the space for time approach, we're also seeing these change over time in the expected direction. So from what I've shown you about this site, we can infer that there's a compositional change from hardwoods to conifers across this coastal gradient. The community structure is rapidly changing from trees to shrubs and then to grasses, and especially Phragmites, and that there's a really impressive pace of change. So all of these kind of have some management implications and can help us understand what status a given site is at if we just kind of walk in without any background or any history. So we're doing a lot more research at this site and several other sites like it. The site became part of what's called the Coastal Critical Zone Network this year. So the critical zone is another NSF program that's developed to do interdisciplinary work, looking at geology, hydrology, biogeochemistry, and ecology all together to understand what's called the critical zone, which is that area of life from the top of the tree canopy down to the groundwater. And we're investigating these event-driven changes like the Melissa type of events, as well as more slow changes due to incremental sea level rise and what that does to those various components of the ecosystem. So as part of that, I've installed these sap flux sensors that I'm really excited about to be able to observe how the trees are using water and what kind of feedbacks that might have to the salinity of the groundwater and the saturation of the soil. We're also going to be doing looking at the soil elevation with this approach called SETs or surface elevation tables, which has been commonly used in coastal environments like marshes, but less so in the forest. So we're going to start to see what is happening to the sediment profile due to saltwater intrusion and overtopping events. We're also going to do eventually a forest disturbance experiment where we girdle the trees in half the plots to be able to mimic a salinity event that kills trees and watch what happens following tree mortality with greater control, because it's a manipulative ecological experiment rather than just observe changes. And working in this kind of environment is actually somewhat dangerous because of all of these dead trees that are constantly dying and falling over. The loblolly pine tends to kind of split in the middle, whereas other trees will topple over at their roots. But we've had definitely some episodes of the trees taking out our research equipment. This is one of a cage, a deer exclosure experiment that my graduate student has, and he's had to take a chainsaw out to cut out a couple of these trees. So that's been kind of an interesting aspect to it. We need hard hats. And then the last thing that I wanted to tell you about was just how I'm using this environment to communicate with people about climate change. So it's a very visual symbol of sea level rise, which is a process that's so incremental, it can be very hard to see it happening over these slow time scales. But the accumulation of these dead tree stacks give us the ability to actually see that change and visualize it. So one of the things we did this summer was to work with some artists. We had 10 artists who joined a group of scientists, including myself, at the Virginia Coast Reserve. We did a couple of socially distanced walks through the ghost forest together, as well as some presentations and discussions on Zoom, so that the artists could learn the scientific perspective of ghost forests, and we could learn about how they're perceiving the ghost forests, which are occurring in their community. For some of them, it was in their backyard. We had one of the artists actually lives on a property that's being totally taken over by sea level rise, and has decided she's just going to live there and watch it kind of succumb to sea level rise. She doesn't want to move. So the gallery that the artists produced based on this experience and this program is available online at this website, and you can go visit. Their works of art are truly beautiful. We also launched a citizen science effort to get people to visit these places and contribute their observations. A lot of people spend time in the coast for recreation, for hikes, and we wanted to see if we could expand our knowledge based on where people are observing change. So this is the website, but I've actually got this QR code. You can actually take your camera phone right now and point it at the screen at the QR code. This is the link to submit your observation, and it's a survey where you can, if you have it open on a tab on your phone, then you'll have it open when you visit these places or go on a coastal walk. And this is an informational website that I'm going to show you in a second, but you can visit on your own computer by using this QR code. So I'll just show you, this is the Storymap website that tells about ghost forests. So there's more information here, and you can click across and see some of the information I've told you about how a ghost forest forms. And then here's where people are contributing their own observations. So it's a little mid-Atlantic centric right now. I'd love to get some more points on there in the Northeast, the Southeast. We actually have one point in Florida, I'm proud to say, but you can click on each one of these points and learn a little more about the ghost forests that people have observed. You learn about the species they've seen, and users are invited to submit a photo of their ghost forest. So these are some of the photos that have been contributed. So with that, I'd like to thank a lot of collaborators on this project, people from different institutions here on the right, and people from my lab at the postdoc, graduate student, technician, and undergraduate stages. And I'd like to thank my funding sources, which are the USDA, NSF Critical Zone Program, and the NSF LTER program. And I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. What a fascinating, in such a short period of time to see those kinds of changes. And I have just so many thoughts and questions, and I want to encourage the audience to type their questions in the Q&A, and I'll try to get to those. As we were coming up to this project, as we were talking about you coming back to Tufts to give this talk, you referred to some of your successes being a result of dumb luck. I've heard other scientists talk about serendipity. I don't think you were working in ghost forests until you started seeing this. This was like it hit you in the head. Could you talk about sort of what triggered the decision to sort of begin to work in this system where you had never worked in it before?
Yeah, it's true. When I was in graduate school, I was studying tidal wetlands and climate change. So I had some little small mesocosm experiments where I was manipulating the temperature inside the mesocosm, looking at the response of the vegetation. So I've always had an interest in kind of global change, climate change, and plants. And when I moved back to the mid-Atlantic, actually I wanted to work on oysters because there's also a big interest in the Chesapeake Bay in restoring the oyster population, which is really over-harvested and kind of a major change. But I just kept looking towards the shoreline and seeing this really remarkable emergence of these ghost forests. And yeah, I just realized I had to go back to wetland work to study it because it's such a remarkable change. And I just really wanted people to know about what was happening to the wetlands in the Chesapeake Bay and the mid-Atlantic. And yeah, I'm just surprised that there's not kind of more research about it.
Yeah, really striking images that really capture the change too. I had a question. You talk about this one really strong tidal surge that brought in all this salt water, and it stayed there for a while and then went back to normal. And then you also showed us a lot of gradual change. And I was wondering, can you parse out gradual versus extreme event impacts on these communities?
Well, so we haven't been able to yet. We have been trying because actually when I started working in the farms, it was interesting to me that the farmers all pointed towards overtopping events, these storm surge and high tide events as being the culprit. But then when we installed our wells, we found that actually the groundwater is saline. And so, we were kind of confused by that result and not sure what was driving the change in the system. And so it's definitely both. There's saltwater intrusion in the groundwater, but then there are these surge events that contribute even greater salinity. So I just started over the past year working with a hydrologist who can really parse out the movement of the groundwater and the changes that occur because of these storm surges, because the salinity, it kind of peaks right at the surge event, infiltrates the soil. And so there's some soil type aspect to this, like some geologies are going to have a lot more runoff of that storm surge, whereas other places, especially like maybe a sand versus clay soil, it's going to percolate more. And so that salinity pulse will stick around for months actually after the storm surge event, long after the waters recede. The waters recede in a couple hours to days, but the salinity persists for months.
Wow. I'm going to try to move to some of the, you can see them too in the Q&A if you want to tap on it. So
Yeah.
Scott Bergen, in the very beginning of your talk, he asks,
Oh,
what is, what's the main difference between New England and the Mid-Atlantic?
thank you for asking that question, Scott, because I meant to say that. The big influence is actually the Gulf Stream. And there was just an article yesterday in the New York Times about the Gulf Stream slowdown. So you can learn a lot more in that article with great graphics. But essentially, the Gulf Stream swings off the coast of North America, right in the mid-Atlantic. And the Gulf Stream is slowing down. And that slowdown, when the Gulf Stream's raging off, it sort of pulls the water with it. As it's slowing down, it's actually resulting in greater rates of sea level rise, interestingly enough, at the mid-Atlantic coastlines. And there's also an aspect of subsidence. And so the mid-Atlantic is actually, the land is subsiding over time as a result of the glaciation that happened a long time ago. Basically, in New England, you might know that the ground is rebounding over time. It's actually it was compressed while the glaciers covered it, and now is actually slowly rising. In the mid-Atlantic, we were kind of at the toe of the glacier, so we were actually buoyed up by the pressure of the glaciers to the north, and now we're subsiding back down.
That's cool. And Linda writes about the similarities between ghost forests and what beavers do. And it did make me wonder, is sort of like, as beaver populations increase, are there any chances that there's an interplay? Because I don't think of them as being on the coast so much, but maybe they're moving into the coast. What's the interplay between sort of the engineering that beavers do and the ghost forests that you're seeing, if any?
Well, I haven't seen any beavers in these coastal forests, but we do have beaver recovery within like the Chesapeake watershed as well. But no, I haven't seen beaver activity. We do see some interesting activity of animals. So in particular, there's pine beetle that love these stressed pines, and I'm kind of interested whether there's an interesting stressor interaction there. And also we're seeing, I have someone doing some live mammal trapping in this forest experiment. And so we're seeing some differences in the small mammal populations across the site. So there's a lot more work to be done there too.
But your answer to this question just begs another one. So you spent a year after Tufts working at what was equivalent to an LTER site, or maybe it is actually an LTER site. It is. And VCR is an LTER site. And how does, like, if a student wanted to go work at any one of these LTER sites, including this one, how does that shape your career? What's the impact of being exposed to all the different kinds of science that happens at an LTER site?
Well, I love being part of a scientific community. Like, as you said, I'm just kind of naturally collaborative. So I love being a place where people are working on all kinds of questions, really gets my mind racing into new areas. And I feel really privileged to have gotten to visit these places where a lot of cool science has been done. You can learn so much about the history of a site where there's been long-term research. But good ways for students to get involved is that most of these sites have research experience for undergrad programs. So the VCR does, you can apply to be a summer researcher and live at the field station for the summer, work with the scientists. So that's a great way to get involved. And yeah, we're actually, we just finished our applications. Otherwise, I'd suggest you apply right now. But next year, and there's a lot of REU opportunities still open across the country.
Yeah. So since you left Tufts, Tufts has the SMFA, the Museum of Fine Arts, has become part of Tufts, which you may or may not have known. So now we have all sorts of students are really, really interested in intersection between art and science, or art and X, right? So Eden writes, can you share more about your experience working with artists to communicate your work? What was the process like, and how did you feel it was beneficial?
Thanks for that question, Eden. It was So exciting to work with these artists. They just had totally different perspective. And honestly, I feel that the Ghost Forest is kind of like a evocative place. Like I visit, it feels a little bit spooky, these kind of snags swaying in the wind, the kind of like emotion you feel just to know the landscape is changing, like in your lifetime, is kind of evocative. And as a scientist, I feel I've never been able to capture that. You know, I try these landscape photos, 360 photos, time series data, and it just doesn't get the point across. But the artists took that feeling and produced these amazing works of art in so many media. So there was like a metal sculpture, painting, photographs, line drawings, textiles, just such a diversity and so much emotion in their work. So it was really beneficial for me to see how they did that. And there was also an exchange because the artists look very closely at their subject in a way maybe sometimes I would not look exactly as closely, trying to see all the different, you know, trying to see the whole. Sometimes you can miss pieces of the parts. And one of the things that the artist brought to us that was really interesting on the walk was these interconnected roots in some of the tipped trees. So roots that actually like circled back underground. And that was really interesting to see. And we dug into it a little bit more. And there's a little bit of research suggesting that that's a way that the trees can actually counter wind shear stress to keep from tipping. So it kind of led down this interesting science avenue as well. And just, I don't know, mostly it taught me about the benefit of interdisciplinary exchange.
Cool, thank you. Shayna writes, what are some of the ultimate goals of your research? You know, what changes do you hope to propel?
Wow. Yeah, the big picture, I guess, for me is about tidal wetland conservation. It's a habitat that I care a lot about. I've researched for a long time, has a lot of benefits to humanity in terms of fishery nurseries and um, carbon storage, things like that. Um, and yeah, it's a threatened habitat. The biodiversity is threatened there by several different factors, including the Phragmites invasion and development and nutrient runoff, but it's also really threatened by sea level rise. And so, you know, I'm studying this process of change in the uplands with the hope that I can retain biodiversity of the marshes in the future and have this ecosystem I care about persist for future generations.
The theme of the class I'm teaching this semester is rewilding. So which sort of implies an active management to sort of rewild. Do you see active management of these marshes being necessary, or are they just going to do it on their own?
Yeah, I'm not sure. My ideas about that kind of ebb and flow, to be honest. Like, I think when I got into this, I was excited about the idea of let's do anything to save this habitat. Like, if it requires drastic action, yes, let's do it. Let's pay for it. And I was even thinking about like, do we need to kill the trees? Like, maybe we need to kill the trees to make room for marsh, and that'll speed up the process and retain the habitat. Um, but now I'm seeing that the change is occurring on its own, and there's a lot of natural resilience mechanisms, and some of these farmlands that are transitioning, for example, we're looking into whether they need to be planted, but actually I see a pretty nice community emerging on its own just because of the salt stress kind of knocking out the species that can't tolerate it, making room for the ones that can. So Phragmites is a big issue, but beyond that, there's a lot of natural resilience.
So let's try to combine these last two questions in the few minutes that we have here. So Will is interested in how these changes are impacting local farmers and how they've adapted. And Anna is thinking about the narrative. So you can weave them if you can, or you can answer them separately.
Um, well, let's see. The farmers are adapting, and some of them are not. I see a real diversity of responses. So the farmers, like the lands become marginal. They some of them have changed the crops that they grow there to be more tolerant crops, and we're trying to get them more ideas about what might be more tolerant and good to grow there. Some of them have abandoned the land that they're farming. And so it is sort of rewilding, and also they're interested in restoration because there are some government programs to pay for restoration and easements. And there's a lot of development of easements around this issue in Maryland, at least. The negative narrative surrounding sea level rise, like, I guess the way I kind of balance the issue that this is, well, it isn't, sea level rise is also negative for tidal marshes. So I don't see a big conflict because, yeah, stopping sea level rise is definitely in the best interest of tidal wetlands and the best interest of humanity. So let's sign that Paris Agreement and get to work. But at the same time, I do want people to know that the appearance of ghost forests is sort of a natural resilience mechanism for tidal marshes. And it's not all bad that we're losing that forest. I think people see it as a death, but I see it as a new life.
Well, that's just a great place to end this. Ghost forest as new life. Keryn, thank you so much for presenting, and thank you all for coming. We'll stop the recording now.
Thank you, Colin.